Afternoon. Afternoon, it's no morning now, it's afternoon. So we're out for another wee walk. Or a bigger wee walk. A big wee walk. So, no mountains today. No mountains today, unfortunately. Just a wee little level walk. So we're just got off the train there at Speen Bridge. Just near Fort William. And our plan is, over the next 2 days, is to walk back to Bridge of Orchy and do a wee overnight just at Carrour Station, somewhere near Carrour Station. So that's the plan. So no up any big hills, just walking along the road. So distance wise, I think it's about 45 miles, 45 miles, and not much ascent at all over the whole thing, about 700 to 800 metres over the whole distance, quite flat. And we'll go over across Rannoch Moor and stuff, so got to be a good couple of days walk. And like always, show you anything of interest and show you the sights and sounds as we head here. So first, day one is about 18 miles and we'll stop, as I said, at Carrour, somewhere near there, and we'll get big Bertha with me. So we'll camp. The hostel's not opened, it's closed, doesn't open until next week, so we're just doing that. Aye. So a lot of track walking, some off-piste stuff, but this is it. Look forward to it. Again, the weather forecast changeable. Looks like it could be pretty wild, pretty wet, so fingers crossed you don't get too much of that, because that'll make a big difference. Anyway, enough yabbering, get walking. Right, see you in a wee bit. See you in a wee bit.
Right, yeah, that's why we were doing this walk and what the original walk was all about. Well, it all goes back to 1889, and the thing that prompted the walk was an Act of Parliament, or at least an Act was proposed in Parliament to build a railway, and this was in autumn of 1888, and this is to build the West Highland Line as we know it today. And to give some support for the Act to get enacted, which was due to go through in the spring, they put together a a group of experts in their field to have a look at this and give their views and the feasibility, etc., of building this railway. So in the end, 7 men get pulled together. One was a contractor, Robert McAlpine. 3 were from design engineers, Charles Foreman, James Bullock, a young guy Harrison. There's 2 land agents, a Major Martin and John Bett, and a lawyer, a solicitor, Mackenzie. Now these are guys who are more used to working in offices inside, townsfolk you may call it. Their task for this was to have a reconnoitre across a Rannoch Moor, which is a fairly it's a fairly daunting prospect for anyone any time of year. So why did they do it in January? Well, to get this act put through in the spring, it didn't give a lot of leeway. The earliest you get organised, and the latest they could really do it, pinned down the date of end of January 1889. So that set the date. Nothing to do with the time of year as the best time to do it. It was actually the worst time to do it. January, February, Scotland, wettest, coldest time of the year. Rannoch Moor in particular, a high moor, 450 above sea level, gets the worst of weathers, very exposed, bitter place. So that set the scene. They were going to Rannoch Moor. The survey they were doing, more a reconnoitre to do a report, was really starting properly Spian Bridge and ending around Gorton, leading on to Loch Tiller near Bridge Orca. So that really was the start of the venture. On their way, it was fairly easy to start with. We were on a wagonette, horse-drawn cart with seats on it, you can picture, trundle along with these guys in the back, sometimes walking, sometimes riding. Got to Spian Bridge, stayed the night. This would be the last couple of nights for quite some time, but they didn't know it at that time. So early one morning they left Spian Bridge and they headed for several miles down the road near Tulloch as it is now, to Inverlayer Lodge. Dropped off, got out of the cart and walked the rest of the way down to the end of Loch Treig, where it's promised to have a boat, a rowing boat, and a man to accompany them, to guide them up to the next place of their journey, which is the south end of Loch Treig at Hunting Lodge. That bit didn't go too well as it turns out, but you can picture the scene. They've walked from the lodge down to the end of the loch. It's raining, it's blowy, breezy, not a very nice day, cloudy. There's no one there to meet them. They're hanging about, no one's turned up. But there is a boat, a rowing boat, so they decide they would head on themselves. So they all loaded up this rowing boat, put their gear in, piled in, and set off, rowing up this loch. Now Loch Treig is a long, narrow loch, maybe 6 miles long, jammed in between mountain ranges at either side. And when it's windy, the wind swirls about it quite viciously. Anyway, they set off, going at the loch quite boldly. It's probably early afternoon by this time. Now, I think we have to bear in mind that at this time of year, sunrise is about 8 o'clock and sunset is about 4:30, 4:45. So it's not a very long day in the winter time. So off they go boldly, rolling up. It's raining, it's windy. As they get out into the loch, it's more exposed to the wind. So they really are battle of the elements by this time. The rain's heavier, the wind's stronger. Hour into their journey, they realise the boat's leaking. So not only are they kind of battling the turn of weather, they've got their boots off and using anything they can find to bail the water at this boat to stop it sinking. You can sort of picture this dilemma now, and it's probably getting dark, dull by this time. They probably realise that they might not get to the end of this loch before it's dark. So they're battling away, not quite waves breaking over the boat, but they were getting into some severe conditions. They kept going, wet, cold, miserable. Probably wonder why they'd left Spian Bridge. And they ran aground. So a few jumped off. They couldn't see a bank to this thing because it was pitch black. So they weren't sure how far from the bank they were, and a couple jumped off to try and look, couldn't quite see, but they managed to shake the boat loose and they got on a bit further. Didn't go too far and it ran aground again. The same sort of thing happens, but this time they couldn't move. With all the commotion they were setting though, there was some, call them locals, from the south end of the loch had come out in their boat and find out what the noise was all about, and they found them. So they managed to get them off and escort them the rest of the way to the end of the loch. They were actually near the end of the loch by this time. So they got there and they walked the last little bit to the lodge, this hunting lodge, where they were expecting to stay a night. They were quite glad to get off their own boat, obviously, after their deal in the loch. And it may be worthwhile remembering that if you translate the name of this loch, Loch Trieg, from the Gaelic, it's Loch of Death. Now that may have passed through one or two minds as they were going up this loch, I don't know. But anyway, as they walked towards the lodge, things were turning to a warm meal, some cosy surroundings, and a warm bed. But that didn't quite work out for them either. They got to the lodge, and the keeper looked at them thinking, who are you, why are you here? He had been told nothing about their coming. But they made do, and they got them some rough beds in an outhouse. They rattled up some bread and water and maybe a hot drink or two. And they nestled down for the night, and not quite the comfortable surroundings they expected, but nonetheless they had shelter from what was now a full-blown storm blowing outside. Let's say they had a good night. Some probably didn't sleep very much, but they did have a night in shelter. Woke up the next morning, sharp, it was still raining, outside, they're ready to go. This is the first day of what's going to be a very long trek, and really quite an adventure. A shepherd was going to escort them up to the start of Rannoch Moor. Yeah, so the deal was that a shepherd was going to escort them from the lodge up to Rannoch Moor. And the distance from the lodge to the moor is about 2, maybe 3 miles. Flat at first, but as soon as you get to the edge of the loch, it rises very steeply from a height of about 100 metres, sorry, about 200 metres and about 400 metres. So there's a couple of hundred metres of rise to get up onto the moor itself. So they left the lodge, being led by the man. 2 minutes out of the lodge, they come to the river, and what was supposed to be a bridge wasn't there. The storm had washed it out in the night, and what was there was a raging torrent of a river, impassable. So it was all back to the lodge, into the loch, into the boats, and rowed around the river to their side and continued on their way. So minor setback to their first day out on foot. Up onto the high moor. It's still raining, but not very heavily. The shepherd's now going to leave them. So he points out onto the moor, into a kind of a veil of water, if you like, into the mist, to just a vastness, and said, that's the way, that's where you're going. And at that point, he turned to leave them, but as a parting message, he said, the weather's looking grim, it's going to change, expect bad weather. So the shepherds left them. They haven't come very far, but already one or two are starting to get tired already. And they set off across the open moor. It's a trudge. The rain's battering down, the wind's blowing in their face. It's spludging all the way along.
So that's us settled in for the night. Early start in the morning, so we'll hopefully get a bit of shut eye just shortly. Listen to some podcasts and stuff, and Hopefully it doesn't rain, too windy. Anyway, bedtime. Catch you in the morning. Right, catch you in the morning.
Walking across a moor is not easy at best of times. When it's wet, it's quite miserable, and you're trying to avoid the bogs, you're trying to avoid real bits of mire. But they plod on, walking into the rain, heads down, and against the wind and the rain, and they carry on for mile after mile. It's about 6 or 7 miles to the River Gore, and at the River Gore they expected to meet a Sir John Mingus, who owns the land there. And the reason for that meeting was to discuss some minor deviation to the rail line at that point. So that was the next venue, and it had expected maybe a few provisions to be brought along by Sir John from his big lodge a few miles further along the road. But anyway, that's a bit to come. They get about 2 or 3 miles in the lodge, and really 1 or 2 are very, very tired, and they're wondering whether they can go in. And this is only a couple of hours into the day. So they stop near a loch called the Loch the Cleaver, and that's got a long story attached to it in itself. And they had a bite to eat from what we describe as meagre rations, and they rested before they continued on their way. And they carried on, and it was from there. It's quite clear some were very, very tired, and as they moved on, the 7 men were strung out across the moor very, very quickly, and they were stopping and starting for them all to catch up, and some were starting to like stagger a little bit. But nonetheless, they persevered and they got to the river, and no one was there. There's no one there to meet them. So they waited in this fairly desolate spot. This is Olive Raya, where it is. The only difference being is that this is the river. And eventually a guy turned up, and it wasn't Sir John, it was one of his gamekeepers or some other representative, and he explained that Sir John couldn't make it. Now, I suppose one look at the weather conditions might explain why he didn't make it, but there was no reasons given, they just couldn't make it. And there was no food, nothing laid on either, but the man passed around his flask to take it from some cheer at the very least. And they offered him accommodation at Sir John's lodge, which was probably 5 miles east. Now they were heading about 7 miles in the other direction. And quite remarkably, looking at it in retrospect, they decided that they were actually going to go on and not take up the offer of this accommodation. Hard to understand, but there you are. Maybe it gives you some insight into the mettle of these guys. They were determined to do what they set out to do, which is recognise the route of this railway line. So after a short stay with the man, there was a boat laid on, a rowing boat, and they got rowed across the river. The river's pretty well impassable in the winter time when there's a lot of heavy rain. They got to our side and they set off again, straight across the moor once more. Roughly parallel to where the railway line is just now. That's what they're to look at. So they're looking at the railway. Although you have to imagine how much time they actually spent looking at land, then head down, try to survive, and making a strike. A mile on, more staggering, one guy goes down. This time he's not getting back up. He's unconscious, they couldn't revive him. This is the old man of the party, 60-year-old John Bett. So, what to do now? They decided that they had to go in to get help for this man, and there's no way they were going to be able to carry him or drag him, so they assigned 2 to stay with him. And this was Major Martin and the young guy Harrison. So they 2 stayed with the prone body of John Bett. He's still alive, but in a bad way. He was totally, utterly exhausted. And the story starts splitting now. These 3 are alone, and the other 4 are setting off to continue on their way and to find help to send back for these guys. They get another 3 miles along. The next two are so weary, they just can't go in any further either. They're tripping and falling at every other step. They were just slowing the whole lot down, and they had to stop repeatedly. So it was decided that these guys had to be left as well. So this time, one other guy was assigned to stay with him, James Bullock. He was the only man who'd been on this moor before, doing a survey for the railway line. And the rest, who, if you're keeping the distance going, one man, Robert McAlpine, was determined, or given the task of going on ahead and trying to get to Gorton Cottage, which was the nearest habitation. And the only habitation really was only the Gorton Cottage, another cottage before you get to Loch Tiller. So he set out alone to get to there. And by this time, it's now dark. Dusk is set in, so it's dark. The only good thing going for them at that stage is that the rain went off. McAlpine later described that the stars came out. So what that's going to tell you is that it was getting right cold in late January. So picture the scene. We've got a group of 3 static. We've got another group of 3 static, but 2 walking winded and a fit man, and one man going on alone to try and get to Gorton Bothy. We call it Gorton Bothy because it's a bothy now, that building. It was Gorton Cottage then. The story starts to get a little bit split at this point, so it's probably best to take one group at a time and try and describe what happens next. Take McAlpine. He was alone, never been there before, but he seemed to know roughly where he went. And after many hours of trudging and falling, and dropping in bogs and all sorts of things, he came very close to Gorton, the cottage, and he only found it out retrospectively. He came across a very, very faint, small track, and he turned left. He found later if he turned right, he was 150 metres from that house, and that would have been shelter, and that would have got help to the rest of the groups, but he didn't. And from then, he got completely and utterly lost, and he wandered all night, lost, cold, wet, totally bedraggled. He was now falling flat on his face and finding it hard to get up, but up he got. Time after time, he trudged on and on and on, knowing he had to get help for these other folk. And by this time, he was near total exhaustion as well, but he forced himself on. Sunset came, and that's quite a quick cut to sunset. It'd be a long time trudging. But sunset came, but he still couldn't see where he was because there was a heavy mist that set in the valley. So he started walking to higher ground, hoping that he would get out of the mist, which he didn't. He just kept wandering, couldn't see anything. About 11 o'clock, just before 11, the mist suddenly went away and opened. As the mist opened, he seen a house. He was on some higher ground, looking down, seen a house, made a beeline straight for it, his spirits soaring, as soaring as he could, near as tired as he must have been at that time. Got to the door, battered the door, heard the door barking, but there was nobody in. 11 o'clock in the morning, nobody there. But before he could take it, the other action was probably to find the way into the house. An old woman came up, and she had been up at Gorton Cottage and was able to give him the message that his comrades were safe. They were all safe, and he was actually the last man to reach a refuge that night. So he was some miles beyond Gorton. He was down near Loch Tiller, and the woman looked after him, put him to bed, tucked him up, got him warm, gave him some hot drinks, nothing too much. and cared for him. And later on, without any doubt, he said that that woman saved his life. So we're cut now back to the second party, and it was a group of 3. And this is Bullock, Foreman and Mackenzie. Foreman was engineer, Mackenzie the lawyer, and Bullock was the chief engineer. Bullock is the stronger of the 3 by far, and the other 2 were able to stagger on a bit, stop, stagger on. So they were kind of walking, moving, going very slowly. So Bullock, who's the only person who'd been there before, decided that he better go on alone. And he left the 2 to make their way as best they could. Stop and start, stop and start, stop and start. So this implies that there must have been some knowledge of where they were going, because I don't think he'd have left them totally alone to carry on the best they could, rather than stay still, static. So Bullock set off on his own. Bullock is McAlpine's somewhere ahead, in the dark. He had a similar journey to McAlpine. He's fallen into bogs, he's stepping into things he wouldn't step in daylight. Not seeing where you're going is a real handicap and something like that. There were about 4 miles to go to this cottage. And he kept going, similar journey to McAlpine. He missed the cottage as well. He walked right by it. But luckily, he fell over a fence. He knocked himself out in doing so, but he quickly recovered. And he'd a kind of sense to think, I fell over a fence. There's no fences on Moor. I must be near some sort of habitation. So he sort of turned round and he walked back and he scoured about, and he eventually found this cottage. You have to feel some sympathy for both McAlpine and Bullock in looking for this cottage. As you go there today, you find this cottage is hidden behind the rise, a big mound of earth. And as you approach it from the moor, all you can see is 2 chimneys sticking up. So unless you know where this cottage is, very, very hard to locate. But he found it, and it was only because he fell over that fence that he found it. But he found it, fell in the door, was just about enough strength to blurt out what happened, where the other guys were, and a couple of shepherds set off with their dog to try and find the other guys. So they're the next people to pick up the rest of that story. So I think we're picking up the shepherds now. They'll tie the rest of the story together. Although bear in mind that the first 3 that come down, they're alone and happy alone all night. And the thoughts that must have went through their mind as to how long it would take for help to come, whether help would come, what their destiny was going to be out there in the moor. But nonetheless, they're still out there. So shepherds set off, and very, very quickly they actually come across the next 2, the first 2, and this is Ford Mackenzie. And the 2 of them were like huddled up, tired and exhausted, behind a big rock when they found them. And they'd been persevering. So before too long they got them guided to the cottage, and they were now safe. And that was 3 of them safe in the cottage. And out they went again, the shepherds, and out to where had been described the first 3 were. How long it took them to get there, we don't know, but it was still during the night, and we think it was probably some time about 3 o'clock in the morning or so, or maybe earlier, where they came across the 3 guys. And it was very lucky, they were shouting, and 2 of the 3 had seen the light of the lantern. Thought at first it was a star, and it disappeared again, then saw it again, and they were shouting. And then the dog heard them, the dog ran up, etc. And the shepherds located them. It was too far to get them back to the cottages, so they decided for the night they would take them to a small hut, which was somewhere to the east of where they went, of where they actually were. So they walked kind of east till they picked up the River Gore. Not the River Gore, there's a dark river, Avon Dhu. And they followed the Avon Dhu until they found a shed. And it was decided that going's easier beside the river. It's more grassy there, and there's less falling in. but it's quite a trip to get them to the hut. They more or less carried the prone man Bet to there. They managed to revive him a little bit with some whisky and a bit of slapping, but really they was carried between two other people to get him to the hut. They stayed there the night. The shepherds went on back up to the cottage, brought back some food in the morning. So it's probably just before dawn when the shepherds got back, got them something to eat, and then they set off. It's not described whether Bet was walking by this time. He was probably walking just a little bit and getting helped. But eventually, after a long, long walk, but at least they had some heat and rest in that hut, they got to the cottage. And that was them reunited with the other three. And at that stage it was only McAlpine were missing. Now we know from the other tale he was actually down the road, but they didn't at that time. So it was only around the time where the three got back to the cottage that news of McAlpine having reached that came back up to Gorton. So the message they got there. And they stayed there for some hours at Gorton, and they got rest, and they got food, and revived themselves. In the meantime, the shepherds were waiting to get a cart from somewhere that they could cart the invalid and anybody else that just couldn't manage it down to Inverrod Hotel, which is probably around 8 miles away from there, but that's a stagecoach point. That was the nearest sort of point to civilization that they were, a stagecoach point. The news that McAlpine was safe at least would have buoyed everyone. And McAlpine knew they were safe, they now knew McAlpine was safe, so by this time they knew the whole outing had a happy ending, albeit this is a tale to tell for many years to come. And later on in the day, they got the cart down and they stopped off at the cottage that McAlpine was at, and they all had a bit of a chin wag and a blather and a laugh, if you like, over what was a long, long ordeal. And they made off to Inverrod after that. But it's a long story, long trek, and these guys were lucky to survive, but they did.
So as I was back at the car, it's been a long day. It's been a long day and we're all tired. Thanks for joining us as always. Thanks for listening to our wee story. And as always, we'll catch you in the next one. Right. Cheers from a very tired ball, very tired legs. Right. Catch you in a wee bit. Cheery. Bye, bye, bye.